Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring work and in particular the skills and structures that we required to allow people to be successful. Although the main focus of my work and this show is human risk, the idea that each person has the potential to pose a risk to their organisation and society, I'm increasingly doing work in the field of what I call human reward. In simple terms, human reward is the opposite of human risk and explores how we can get the best out of people. Notice best, not most. This is not about exploitation. Human risk and human reward are interrelated. If we focus too much on human risk, we'll miss opportunities for encouraging human reward. Equally, if we just focus on human reward, we'll unleash loads of human risk. The challenge facing employers and society in the 21st century is therefore balancing these two dynamics, getting the best out of people while mitigating the risks they pose. Now, one of the ways that we can maximise human reward and minimise human risk is to make our workplaces more diverse. By bringing in fresh ways of thinking, we can find new solutions to problems and mitigate biases like groupthink or confirmation bias. Which is why I'm really intrigued by a project called the Inclusion Initiative at LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science. The director of the Inclusion Initiative, Dr. Grace Lordan, is a friend of the show. I thought I'd get some of her colleagues on from the Inclusion Initiative to help us understand more about it. So on this episode and the next, we're looking at inclusion-related topics. My guest on this episode is Cecily Josten. She's a research officer at the Inclusion Initiative. Her areas of research include gender-related inclusion and the skills of the future. What do we need to be successful going forward? And in particular, what role will cognitive and social skills play in building inclusive environments? This was such a pleasure to record, and in our discussion, Cecily and I explore a broad range of topics looking at skills and inclusion. So please enjoy my discussion with Cecily Josten. Cecily, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you so much, Christian, for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here on the show. And look, before we start, I wonder, can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, of course. So my name is Cecily Josten. I am a research officer at the Inclusion Initiative, which aims at promoting inclusion at work. I'm also in my final year of my PhD, where I study the role of personality and non-cognitive skills more generally in the labor market. And I'm an economist by training and have worked in consulting for a bit before I now turned to behavioral science. I'm particularly focusing on the future of work, what skills will matter for the future of work. But I'm also developing an index that captures what makes an individual inclusive. And I look at whether personality traits are rewarded differently for men and for women. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do and what I'm interested in.
So you're basically dissecting the world of work and looking at the dynamics. I mean, we talk about work as a generic thing, but obviously it's very different, a very different experience for different people. And there's obviously big differences between what men experience and what women experience. What prompted you to look at that? Is that personal experience that's driven that?
Kind of. I mean, I've always been interested in sort of psychology and the psychology behind a lot of things, and I've been prompted to do it. I mean, I've always sort of, even like throughout my education, but also throughout work experience, I've realized that personality, but also human interaction is much more important than we think often. So I don't know, for example, before I knew the term of it, like something like having an open or closed mindset was something I had experienced a lot and could see how having an open mindset, for example, fosters very much sort of positive team dynamics. And to me, that was always interesting. And I thought it wasn't sort of researched enough or wasn't taken into account as much as part of, for example, the hiring process within companies. And then I studied in my master's with Grace Lordan, who I think you talked to already as well,
Yep.
The director of the Inclusion Initiative. And together with her, we sort of looked at how personality affects individual outcomes, how personality affects whether you smoke or not, and how that can sort of promote positive like health outcomes in a way. And from there, I sort of then turned to how personality affects labor market outcomes, so human interaction more generally. So rather than just how it affects you as an individual, how it also affects your surrounding, and that is where I'm now and where I'm really interested in. And I feel like it's a topic that's becoming more and more important now with COVID, but also with like automation and things like that. It really shows how personality and specific skills have become sort of more relevant.
And I find it fascinating because we've built an education system, and I think particularly of what we teach people at school, but obviously university and vocational training also relevant to this. We've built it on certain presumptions. So a good example, I think, would be in history, we're going to teach you, and I remember I had to learn lots of facts when I was at school that were sort of, I think were a proxy for let's make you pay attention and we'll give you some context, and then you can memorize the names of the kings of England and what order and what years they. Utterly useless information nowadays. And it occurs to me that a lot of the education system is designed very much around a view of the world that's not necessarily valid. So what you're really sort of looking at here is to say, what do we need in the 21st century, both as individuals but also as a society, and how the structures that we've put in place. We talk about the labour market as if it's a sort of fixed thing that somebody's running and organising behind the scenes. But there's lots of things that aren't necessarily fit for purpose that have led to the outcomes that we're seeing today.
Definitely. And like you said, I totally agree with, in terms of education. I mean, a lot of what we learn, I think, is very much like repeating what others have said, or learning specific sort of ways of, I mean, we learn like how to, I don't know, to calculate or something with it, but we don't really learn how to understand things and how to question things also and challenge things. And I think that is something that we now see. I mean, it's something that's becoming ever more important, because if we think about automation, which is something I talk a lot about or research a lot, if we really think that, for example, machines are going to replace what we do now, then knowing a specific calculation will not be as important anymore. But what is really important is really sort of challenging what we do and complementing machines or algorithms in a way that's reasonable and in a sort of analytical way. And I think that is something that the education system really has to take on. And the labor market, like you said, this like very sort of abstract term, which means, I mean, companies, but employees as well. It is also very much about sort of how do we train and upskill employees, or also managers, or also companies as a whole, to make them fit for the future and to be successful.
So can you talk a little bit, you mentioned COVID, and I think it's just probably worth exploring. There are lots of things that have changed as a result of that. What have you seen when you've thought about that?
Yeah, I find it, and this is something I'm reading a lot about recently also, I find it fascinating because, like I said, I mean, for a long time or before COVID, we have been talking a lot about how automation is going to replace jobs, and how actually, I mean, the future is going to look dire with about, 47% of jobs being at risk of being replaced. And the idea that, well, there won't be employment in the sort of mid to long-term future. But now with COVID, COVID has actually accelerated a lot of those phenomena, right? Because labor has become a lot more expensive, and because a lot of people there's a lot more sick days. And you could tell with COVID, employees weren't as reliable in a way anymore. So I guess this has made investment in automation even more attractive. And we could also see that there's a lot of investment in technology. Now we can do all the meetings via Zoom, right? And pretty much everything has sort of, in terms technology-wise, pretty much all the companies have improved in that respect. So you would think that there's even more of this automation phenomena where we have less demand for employees. But then at the same time, we find ourselves in a very big labor shortage. Like wherever we go now, like whichever airport or whichever parcel we expect or whichever restaurant we go to, we can see that there's labor shortages pretty much everywhere, right? And that is interesting because, first of all, it's kind of unexpected. But then second, I think it really shows this sort of skills gap that we have, where first, there's a lot of skilled employees that are needed, but companies struggle to find them. But then there's also an increased demand for sort of flexibility from an employee perspective. It just shows, I think, how the human aspects of work have become sort of ever more important. Yeah, and so both from the perspective of the employee, like wanting to have more flexibility, but also wanting to have a work that's sort of fulfilling or has a purpose. But then also from the employer's perspective, having employees that are sort of skilled and trained and fit for the sort of 21st century or the fourth industrial revolution. And this is interesting because and I think it has shown that this is like a really big challenge of now and of the future. How do we actually get there, that we can sort of bridge that skills gap and manage to have sort of successful work environments.
One of the things that's interesting about COVID is obviously the impact it's had on different subsets of people. So it's clearly been easier for people, I'll put it in simple terms, with privilege and with wealth. There's been a differential impact on men and women. Can you talk a bit about that and how that's also changed things?
Yes, definitely. So we see with COVID that it did have a massive differential impact on men and women, and also people of color, or ethnic minorities. This is partly due to the fact that, I guess also before COVID, you would think that having the increased flexibility of being able to work from home, even in those privileged occupations that you just mentioned, is something that benefits women, right? Because it would be easier to sort of combine like family life with working. But in the end, it actually shows that women bore the largest burden of work at home. And so we see that particularly for women with children in school age, who had to, with education systems sort of failing or slowly adapting to the situation, parents had to take a lot of the responsibility of educating their children. And so we see that those women actually exited the labor market at a much higher rate than men compared. But then, and then we also see, I guess, that COVID had placed a financial burden on many individuals, and this is also something that we see particularly for women and people of ethnic minorities. And then I thought one interesting finding, I think, is also that the mental health of women suffered also a lot more than that of men. And this is even when you control for things like childcare and financial issues. And the research really explains this with the fact that women actually suffered a lot from the lack of social interaction more than men do. And this seems to be just a difference in men and women. Even in terms of mental health, you can see that women were affected much more by the pandemic than men. And so those things, I think it has shown how important it is to look at those differential impacts. And this is something I've been looking at before also in my research, whether men and women are treated differently in the labor market. And the pandemic has really highlighted this. And unfortunately, it has put us back a little bit in time, I think, because of the fact that women exited the labor market. It really is a shame, because you would think that there's only a way up in terms of labor market participation.
Right, because that's fascinating, because it feels counterintuitive, as you say, because if a move to flexible working more, in theory, so at a time when there are shortages out there, more opportunities for people, technology enables more flexible working, greater power in some respects for the employee rather than the employer. So the balance shifting slightly. You would think all of that would point towards this is good news. And clearly for the people that benefit from it, it is good news. But what you're basically saying is actually, that's really interesting, that from a relative piece, actually, you're saying it's taken equality backwards as opposed to forwards.
Yeah, exactly. I think, at least, I think in theory or in practice, it still really is important to have flexibility for women. And in going forward, it is something I think that we can take out of the pandemic that is actually very positive, and that it also benefits women. But the thing is really inequality, like you said, because it only works if men and women take up the same sort of amount of take out the same sort of amount of flexibility and really take advantage of this, and then sort of share any kind of responsibilities. And if we sort of if flexibility means that women are out of the labor market, it also means that we should be helping those women to come back and to make it easy to come back to work in a way. So I think the flexibility comes with a lot of sort of challenges that we have to tackle alongside. And I think in the beginning of the pandemic, we didn't really know that, right? So there wasn't really anything that was done about this. But I think now going forward, we can keep the flexibility, but then make sure that no one is left behind. And that is really the challenge, I think.
And I think what you're pointing towards is something that we've seen in lots of areas. So if I think about supply chains, for example, the idea of having a just-in-time supply chain sounded great until things couldn't arrive for reasons that we know. And so if I think about that in terms of the labor market and some of the dynamics that you're talking about, in many respects, what felt like progress in terms of equal opportunities, a long way to go still, let's be clear about that. But there was a distinct feeling that we were progressing and moving in a certain direction. And what you're basically, I think, suggesting, and correct me if this is wrong, is that actually that's exposed that perhaps it wasn't quite as, we hadn't built it on quite a sustainable basis as we might have liked to think.
Yes, I think so. And I think a lot of the things the pandemic has, I guess, shown exactly those things where, I mean, like you said, like supply chains, there's just a lot more to sort of think about those things. And with people management, I think the pandemic has shown that it's a lot more important to really look a bit more closely, I think, because oftentimes I think we sort of have been thinking of sort of HR departments or like just generally like sort of people management, if you would call it like this, as something that's necessary for hiring and maybe also for sort of promoting good company dynamics or something, but it wasn't really regarded as essential as I think the pandemic has shown as it is now. So there really is a responsibility that lies within companies, but also, yeah, like I said, HR departments, maybe, I don't know, to really look a bit more closely. And this is where things like people analytics come in, for example, really looking closely. It's more than just, I mean, this brings us to, I guess, one of my other topics, which is inclusion. We talk a lot about diversity, and I guess companies do now look at the numbers for diversity, but it's just not enough to be looking at, okay, we have 50% women, 50% men, but it really is important to look at the numbers more closely. Do we see that following the pandemic, more women have exited, and what is the reason for this? And similarly, how many women return from maternity leave as compared to men from paternity leave? Those kind of things, I think we need to look at a lot more closely. And the pandemic has shown how important it is to look at those numbers, but also to look at sort of what is behind those numbers and really knowing the stories behind those numbers to be able to really retain a workforce that is sustainable in a way.
I'm sure some people listening to this are going to tell me that this is not all HR functions, but
yeah, exactly.
There's a clue in the word human resources. Right, there's the human bit, and then we get hit with resources, which makes it sound, almost completely the opposite. But it's very transactional. So we'll have HR to hire people, and maybe we'll do a pay round, and then maybe there's some training. But it's not a sort of thinking about some of these fundamental pieces. And so what you're, I think, pointing towards is a big challenge here, which is that if organizations want to deploy human capital most effectively, let's use the sort of, economic terminology, then we've really got to start thinking about the nature of that human capital and, where we get it from, how we nurture it. And we have to start treating it, I always think, a little bit like we would treat any other. Maybe it's like a garden that we have to tend, or even if we're buying equipment, you need to maintain that equipment and think about how to get the best out of it. And so what you're pointing towards here is quite a big shift of saying we really have to start caring about this human aspect, because what we're seeing is if we just adopt a transactional approach to it and we just sort of box tick in some respects, we're not going to get the best outcomes possible. We are going to continue to hire from the same sort of people. We're going to retain a certain subset of the people for whom the way we do things works, but we're not going to get the benefits of diversity and inclusion. And we're possibly therefore not going to solve the problems of the 21st century because we're just going to have more concentration of the same type of thinking. And so you're pointing really to a rethink. And again, I stress lots of people will say, well, we are doing that. But I think overall, your point would be, and again, tell me if this is wrong, is that we need to sort of fundamentally rethink, well, what is HR and what do we need to do to be able to maximize human capital?
Exactly. And I think you're right in terms of maybe it's not the sole responsibility of the HR department, and that I think is true, because it really needs to, like you also said, like with the tending the garden, those kind of things, it really needs to be sort of the responsibility of the entire team, the entire company, of everyone, really acknowledging that this human aspect is so important and is actually what will remain important also for the future, much more than a lot of other things that we currently value in the labor market. And I think it's also important to look at this personality or skills topic from a perspective also. I mean, a lot of what we think of when we think of sort of running a company well is performance indicators, right? But in terms of human resources, we don't necessarily think of the link to performance outcomes in a way, or oftentimes it's not as clear cut. But I think we really need to also think about this in that way, because if you think of like inclusion, for example, there's a lot of positive outcomes in terms of innovation or innovative behavior, but it also reduces human risks. So it reduces sort of the, like, if we have a bunch of similar people sitting around the table, it's very unlikely that we have like a challenging conversation, or that we embrace conflict. But this sometimes is important also, not to have like sort of any negative outcomes. And I think it is important to look at this human aspect both from an intrinsic value, because it does have an intrinsic value, I think, for every one of us. I guess purpose at work or those kind of topics, it's also, since the pandemic, have come up a lot more than before. But also from this aspect of what does it actually do to help foster a positive and also in terms of performance, like to have a good work outcomes and good outcomes more generally. And I think once that is sort of appreciated a lot more, I think it would help a lot of companies to foster those things a lot more than in a sort of structured way, as we look at other things like profit margins or something.
I'm really struck listening to you and reflecting on the subject that, again, back to the comment about the education system, where there are some inbuilt presumptions about and look, it was a long time since I was at school, so I know things have changed. But bottom line is there's a sort of inbuilt presumption about the things that you need to know to get on with in life. And we can see the downsides, for example, of not teaching people things like critical thinking and an ability to challenge statistics and facts that are presented to people. Lots of skills that people have been taught at school that are not necessarily as relevant today as they were before, though I might question whether they were ever relevant. Oh, it strikes me that that you could almost deploy the same thing when looking at a company, and you'd sort of say, look, are the structures and processes that we have in place, everything from the hiring to the promotion piece to the way we do things, the way we run meetings, how we operate, has similar challenges, and that we have perpetuated models in the same way that, for example, historically meetings in companies pre-COVID, well, we get everybody together in a room and we'll sit together for an hour, regardless of whether or not the subject warrants an hour. Whereas now in the digital world, you can have a 5-minute meeting because you haven't dragged everybody. There's a different way of doing things. And it seems to me that when we look at how we can maximize human capital, we need to start fundamentally rejigging lots of processes in the way we look at what does success mean, what are we looking for in our people, thinking less in terms of how well does that individual fit inside a box that we've predefined, and more into how do we get the best out of that person.
Yes, exactly. And I think those, like you said, like in terms of education, I think education should become a really crucial part also of your life as an employee, because it shouldn't stop at school, right? Because at school, where we learn maybe we learn about specific topics, we might also learn how to learn, which is crucial. But what is also crucial are things that, like I said, will likely become more relevant, that we still need to learn even now, and that we haven't stopped learning. Things like adaptability, for example. The pandemic has shown how important that has become, like staying flexible in terms of both how you work, but also what you work over your lifetime. It's very likely that we won't, like someone starting their career now will stay in the same career for the entire life. So there's a need for a lot of adaptability and, I guess, resilience that has been talked about a lot during the pandemic and after. But then also things like decision making is something that's really crucial, but that, again, we don't really learn as much in school, where we really need to, with an ever increasing complex world and ever more increasingly more complex decisions that we're confronted with. I think it would be really important to learn how to deal with complex problems. And And this, like, research has shown that, for example, decision making has become really important alongside cognitive skills that have always been relevant. But this again also reduces biases in behaviors, those kind of things. Yeah, and also things like creativity. Again, it's something that we don't really learn. I mean, and here I don't mean creativity in the artistic sense, like you don't have to be a good painter or drawer, but you have to be creative in terms of how you approach problems. And all of those things, I think, are relevant across pretty much all occupations, but they are not really taught. And this is something I think that will be really crucial going forward, really having this sort of, as part of your career, having this constant sort of learning curve where you work on yourselves and work on how you work with others and how to sort of improve that. And I think it's pretty much like you said about machinery. We also sort of tend our machinery in a way that it stays on as long as possible. So we have to sort of do that with employees as well, where we really have to sort of care for them. And this is something I think was always on, and I think it's a responsibility of the employees as well. It's not just, okay, the company has to do that, but it's just something that will become more important, I think.
That's really interesting, because if we look at norms in the workplace, for want of a better phrase, so the the way things are done, I think it's fascinating that there's a requirement on people to conform to that. And so if you look at things like annual appraisal processes, it's an exercise in saying, here's what we wanted you to do, and here's how you fulfilled that. So at the end of the year, the assessment for me would be, how well has Christian slotted into this box that we've created? And the answer is, some bits will be fine and good, other bits will be less good. But it's constantly assessing me against a predefined set of norms. And I speak here as a white middle-aged male. So there's a higher likelihood that I can fit into that than perhaps certain other people. But it's a lot about conformity and sort of filling in processes. And so as you were talking, I was thinking, well, there's appraisal processes that drive you to, will assess you against our fixed set of criteria. There's an encouragement to sort of conform in the sense of, challenge is encouraged but not encouraged. That's the way we do things around here type logic. And of course, there are very good reasons why that exists in certain contexts where creativity is less desirable. Nuclear power station would be a good example. I don't want someone going crazy there and just making things up as they go along. Food safety would be another. But what's interesting is that to get the best out of people requires us potentially to think slightly differently and to start saying, well, actually, one, are we giving them the tools that they need, so the soft skills and technical skills, obviously, where that's relevant, to be able to navigate this changing landscape? And so there's almost a shift I see in what you're saying from these traditional assessment processes, recruitment processes, all these sorts of things, just the way we do things, the way we run meetings, the way we encourage challenge, the training that we give people. There's a real shift required here, is what you're saying, I think, to meet the demands of the 21st century and to make sure that we get the best possible brains on the challenges we're facing.
Yeah, and I think definitely, and I think when you talk about norms, I think that is a crucial challenge also that we do need to tackle, because I think norms do matter massively in the labor market as of now. And I think we see that, I mean, particularly obviously also with going back to the differential effects for men and women. I mean, women often have like a lot higher sort of put against those norms that are often white male in a way. And I think it's really, it really is a challenge to go against those norms. And I think it speaks a lot. I mean, it takes a lot of strength, I think, to tackle those norms, because a lot of this is very ingrained in us as people, in us as a society. A lot of things we don't even reflect on. And I think increasing even the awareness is already helpful. Where do we have norms? How do those norms play against specific individuals? How can we address them? Because oftentimes it's very sort of unconscious, right? And this is, I mean, I guess companies are now tackling this with things like unconscious bias trainings or other forms of trainings, where the idea is really to point towards where norms sort of negatively affect the way in which we treat employees or in the way in which we work together. But then I think there's still a lot more to be done. Like, a lot of those trainings have been shown to be sort of ineffective because it's like a one-off training. Everybody is like, oh, I see where, for example, I have an unconscious bias and I treat people differently, or I treat, I don't know, for example, people who are like me a lot more favorably. But this is oftentimes not really done in a very sustainable way. So I think to really overcome those norms, it takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of repeated effort. So I think having first increasing the awareness, but then also having sort of actual or regular trainings, but also sort of implementing specific things like auditing meetings or something is really crucial, because things like groupthink or something like I said, people just hiring people like us, I think they're really need to be challenged constantly for it to really be sort of then ingrained in people, that the way we sort of have been doing things might not be the best way, in a way, if that makes sense.
No, that makes perfect sense. And it's interesting because when you talk about things like unconscious bias training, and there are episodes where I've discussed that, so I'll put links to that in the show notes. But what I think is fascinating about that is the start point for a lot of these solutions is, it's the people within the organization that we need to reprogram, right? So if we've got unconscious bias, it's not because the organization has structured itself in a particular way, has incentivized particular behaviors. It's the bad people that we need to reprogram. So if we can send everybody on a course that will fix that problem, all good, right? That's what we need to do. That's how we need to. I would argue, of course, we need to look at the individuals and individual behavior, because ultimately collective behavior is a lot of individual behavior aggregated. But I think sometimes organizations hide behind that and they do the same thing, and something goes wrong in the organization, bad people. We don't look at the structural reasons why that's happening. And I think when you talk about shifting norms, thinking about the way we do things, often those things are organizationally driven, because there are structures and incentives in place that, unless challenged, will continue to perpetuate the way things have always been done. So I think there's a really interesting idea here that if unconscious bias, we will solve that by bringing everybody onto a training course and we'll just tell them what they're doing wrong. And then it will solve itself. And of course, I think making people aware of it is a good thing, but expecting that to be the silver bullet, I think, is a bit of a challenge, because there are some structural reasons as to why some of these trends are happening and why some of these norms exist.
Yeah, I almost think that those unconscious bias trainings are almost dangerous in a way in that respect, because it's almost like, okay, we've done this unconscious bias training, we're done, and we can go ahead. And in a way, it's kind of like it serves as a good excuse to be like, okay, I've tackled this problem. We are diverse now. Let's go on. Whereas, no, I honestly think so, because sometimes it's like, okay, there's a lot of talk about, I guess, those like diversity and like tackling norms and trying to sort of do specific trainings, but it really needs to be sort of substantial. It needs to be also, I mean, a lot of what we do now at the Inclusion Initiative is look at, okay, first of all, how can we measure whether within a company, like our company, is inclusive in the first place? And this is something that I think is important, because we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, but oftentimes we don't really know what we're talking about here. And then secondly, how do we measure the impact of specific things? So I think it's much more than just being like, okay, I'm dedicated to this topic and I really want to foster it. It needs more than just the motivation to change things, and it really needs this like long-term sort of commitment to it. And this means that a lot of what we do, I think it's a trial and error, right? Because currently we don't know what the silver bullet is in terms of how do we foster good company culture. A lot of it is we don't know, and a lot of it is also it's difficult often. And like you said, I mean, those things like human risk also, it's just often also very unpredictable. So, but that means that a lot of what we do should be done in a way that's sort of, that we can be held accountable for, in terms of running sort of experiments that measure whether something like an unconscious bias training was actually successful and whether the culture has changed following specific trainings. And those things, I think, are really important. And like I said earlier, like those people analytics features as well, it has become more important, but it's also important to not just look at it from the surface, but look at it a little bit more deeply and not really knowing what is going on. I think it's really important.
It's funny because I love this idea of sort of, we wouldn't think, if somebody said, I've got let's pick an extreme example, right? I've got an alcohol or drugs problem, right? You wouldn't go, I'm going to send you on an hour's worth of training and we'll fix that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? That just you think that was crazy? What a stupid idea. And yet we talk about, and that's conscious, right? You know that you've got that because you can see the dynamics. So why do we think that doing something for something that's on some level is conscious, right? There's clearly an unconscious approach. Why do we think that would be ridiculous? And yet for something like unconscious bias, the clue is in the first word.
Yeah, exactly.
Why do we think that's going to work? And so I think it's a really interesting piece. So we have to admit the problem is there in the first place. And I think that's where what you're doing is interesting because you're starting to expose things. So, I'm not claiming to be an expert in any way, shape or form, but I have a reasonable awareness of these topics, having spoken to people and sort of thought about it a bit. A long way to go in terms of some of my behaviors, no question about that. But when I look at that basic thing, I've thought about, and even I was struggling with the COVID seemed to me in general, with the start point that you talked about was, there's more flexibility in work, more power for the employee. That ought to be great. And then suddenly you present me with something that says, actually, it's not. And here's the reasons why. And so it's a bit more complicated than we initially think, and we have to think hard about these things and recognize that there isn't a single, I think the silver bullet thing, there isn't a single silver bullet. What we need to do is reflect on what are all of the factors and where can we make easy changes. And maybe there is a training course that has some effect somehow, but also we've got to look at some of the other drivers of behavior. And we know that training on its own is insufficient. If you train someone, be ethical, and then you incentivize them not to be ethical by the way that you either protect their job or you bonus them, then they're going to follow that incentive. Equally, if we know that whatever we're told in our induction training about this is an ethical company, we do believe in these things, and then you go out into the reality of the workplace and you discover it's not, your lived reality is going to be much more important to you than whatever you've heard in some training course that's run for a very small proportion of the time that you've been with them. And so I think what you're pointing towards here is almost a thing that says this is really complicated. We need to think hard about it. And, we need to possibly accept that sadly, in the same way as dieting and lots of other things in life, changing human behavior isn't just simply a case of we're just going to tell you to behave differently and you'll do it.
Yeah, and I totally agree. And I think, I'm a firm believer that people can change and people can actually change, even work on their personality. But we shouldn't forget that a lot of the personality is quite fixed over time, and it requires really hard work. And I mean, it's not like we work on our personality every day or we work on our behavior every day. And I think, like you said, there's some low-hanging fruits where some behavior can be quite easily, first of all, can be quite easily sort of observed and then also quite easily be changed. But then a lot of the things I think are are on a deeper level. So a lot of the things are very much ingrained in us as people. And while I think that it's not fixed forever, I still think it requires a lot of work. And it's not just an easy fix where we can say, okay, we have this one training. And I think the analogy with the person with alcohol problems is very good in this because, of course, we can't, there's a lot of things that have happened to get to this point. And so it also requires a lot of steps to sort of go back and change. And I think, it's just not as straightforward. Plus, we don't know what exactly is the perfect behavior, right? So this is something we also try to find out. We try to think of what does it even mean to be sort of inclusive? Like, what is the good part of it? It really, we need to understand this first, I think, before really training individuals in a way that we think is helpful. It really is okay, what is it about, for example, inclusion that makes work outcomes positive? What is it about collaboration, decision making, those kind of things that is really sort of important? And in what context does it work? I think context is also really important and also often forgotten because where we design this, I'm bashing unconscious bias trainings now, but what is it about unconscious bias training that works for every company? I doubt there is something that works for every company. So I just think, we need to go on one level deeper and think about what works in which context and what is it about what works that is really important. And there, I think there's just many nuances, and it's important to know of them and about them, and knowing how to foster them. And this is something that we're still sort of learning, I think.
And I guess one of the counterweights to that argument, and I can concoct a logical counter argument to what I'm about to say, but one of the challenges for companies is that with a fluid labor market, this idea that we join one company and stay there for life Sure, there are career paths where that happens. So if you spent ages qualifying as a doctor, you're a bit more locked into something than if you've just started to work in a sales role, for example, because of the time that you've invested in the process and the logic that the barrier to entry to becoming a doctor is quite huge in terms of the time commitment that you need, and so you're more likely to stick at it. Not true for everybody, but there are those broad things. But most people are going to end up, I think, doing lots of different things and having quite fluid career paths. And of course, that might point to companies being less willing to invest in people. Now, the counter argument to that is, well, you need to accept that dynamic is there, and you may bring people back later on. And of course, if your argument is, well, you're not sticking around, I'm not going to train you, I'm not going to do anything useful for you, that doesn't make you an attractive employer. But nonetheless, the natural human tendency to think, well, you're not going to be around for that long, well, there's a risk of you leaving to go and do something else, so I don't need to invest as much, I don't need to think as hard about that, I think is going to become more of a challenge as we go forward. And so all the things you're talking about, the investment in people and getting the best out of them is quite challenging in a world where you might think, well, I don't know how long they're going to be around for. I can't guarantee that my investments are going to come good for me.
Yeah, that is an interesting aspect of this, because I think, this I tried to talk about earlier also, it's just who has the responsibility in training individuals for the workplace. And I think you're right in that the companies have less of an incentive to do so, even though it becomes ever more important. And I think this is the case, but it's also a shame that this is such an important topic, because I feel like it's the same also with, I don't know, topics like gender parity or something. Oftentimes companies would be like, oh, this is not within our responsibility to have, I can't really do anything about it. It's having, like, for example, I don't know, a common reply to, for example, gender quotas, I find is that companies are like, oh, what do we do about it? Like, we don't have enough women, like, to place them in the top positions, and this is not our fault. Whereas it should be, I don't know whether the responsibility should lie also partly on the organization, right, to foster sort of women right from the start from their career, and the same with, like, those sort of skills and personality should be something that is fostered right from the beginning of your career. I can definitely see why companies might refrain from doing that. And I think, I don't know of an innovative solution to that yet, but I think it should be an important investment. And I don't know, if individuals themselves invest into it, like, themselves, I'm not so sure. I think currently it very much is expected of companies, right? And if we look back at the education system, the school education system, I think a lot of it can already be sort of ingrained in there as well. But I guess this also takes a lot of sort of efforts, and so things like decision making or adaptability, those kind of things, I think they can be taught from a very early age onwards, and this would be really crucial. But then it shouldn't stop, and it should be fostered further within the company. But I agree, I don't know of a system that works yet where maybe companies can share the responsibility, or I don't know, there's some kind of incentive still to invest in skills for companies.
But it is really interesting when you talk about the sorts of skills that we need. So resilience is one that you've mentioned. I think it's pretty obvious why that's not just a useful thing to have, but absolutely necessary given some of the dynamics that we see. And what I think is interesting is you're spot on that it's incumbent on the employee to look after themselves. I always thought it's a bit weird when you think about career development discussion. You're going and talking to someone about your career, so your manager or whoever it is that you have the conversation with in the organization. But there's an inherent conflict of interest, because unless they are open-minded, unless they genuinely look at your interest, their advice is always going to be tainted by the fact that they want to keep you in the organization. Yeah. Companies sort of think about how can we move you to another role within the organization to keep you in. Now, that might not be the best thing for you. And so there's an obvious example where actually people do need to take control of their own careers and think for themselves and say, well, what do I need to improve myself? And that might not be the thing that my employer wants me to learn. Maybe that makes me more marketable in simple terms. And so it is absolutely incumbent on the employee to do something. And we've all hidden behind this idea that career development is something that sort of it's almost implicit in the employment contract. People say, well, we will help you with your career development. Yes, you will, but you'll do it in a manner that serves your needs probably more than mine. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the opportunity for these to learn these new skills needs to be offered to people in ways that are easy. So companies need to make the time available. So even if they don't want to fund it, do people have the time to go and do this sort of training and experience? Are they allowed to do it? Yeah. Maybe situations where it makes more sense for it to be done in-house and formally and give people access to that. But of course, that represents a threat. So in some respects, I can see this, along with a lot of things we've talked about, is kind of the status quo doesn't encourage the sorts of behaviors you're looking at. And so I think we have to recognize there's change needed on the part of the employer. But also, I think to your point, employees need to feel more empowered to do that.
Yeah, and I think, the responsibility shifts to the employer, I think, once the situation inhibits kind of employees, right? There's a lot of situations where you can think of, like if we think about discrimination or those kind of things, I think it very much is on the responsibility of the employer to be treating those things, even if that means training for the individual, and even if that individual leaves after a while, it still is sort of should be seen as something that's crucial, and that is on the responsibility of the employer. But then, of course, other skills that make you sort of more versatile or make you sort of more employable, more marketable, maybe that is on the responsibility of the individual. But then with increased flexibility, and I think this is something with COVID, employees demand a lot more. You should be given this time for extra sort of for learning, or this time for sort of for yourselves in a way. And I think there will be a lot more of those sort of work arrangements where we combine the career that we have with something that sort of improves us as a person, whether that's funded from the company or self-funded, or that we need to see. But I think, going forward, I think it will just take up an amount of time, that like a crucial amount of time in the work we do, because we need to sort of stay agile.
One of the things that's interesting, you use the word agile, which in recent years has been talked about in terms of technology and loosely defined working practices. And so that's all about the architecture that we use and our approach to doing things. But it's interesting, that shift into talking about it as individuals runs completely contrary to the thing I was talking about before, which is this idea of we might do an apprenticeship in something, to use traditional terminology, and then we stick at that. That's our trade. That's a sort of very old-fashioned view of the world, that you get something and then that's what you will do for the rest of your life. What you're pointing towards is that requires agility of mind to be able to think about the necessity of that. So there's an irony in there that it's sort of, there's a natural barrier to it, one, with the structures that we have in place, but secondly, the way we've always thought about, even the word career, I think is interesting. Work, what do these things mean? That's framing the whole arena in a way that's not necessarily helpful to the dynamics you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think that is where I guess we hit a lot of barriers also when talking about those topics. In the theoretical aspect, it would be wonderful to think of a world where everything is like really flexible and we can really work on our skill set and on our personality constantly. But then I think in reality, a lot of how work works still currently is very much focused on how it used to be. And like you said, there's still apprenticeships, there's still career paths, there's still barriers to entry for specific occupations that are very rigid and still very focused on what we used to do. So having to have like specific degrees for specific occupations, and it's obviously important for things like being a doctor or so. You have to have the degree, otherwise the system would fail, I guess. But but in terms of like a lot of the sort of, if we think of those professional occupations, it still is oftentimes very rigid. And I see that changing, but I think it's, again, a process that takes time.
We've talked about resilience type skills. You mentioned a little bit about cognitive skills that are useful. So we talked about sort of de-biasing and being open-minded. I wondered, are there other areas? For example, social skills seems to me to be an area that we ought to be thinking a lot more about.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the research has shown that social skills have become increasingly important, but actually alongside cognitive skills. And this is interesting because it's not that we should abandon everything that we've done so far and only be sort of investing in social skills. It's the combination of social skills and cognitive skills that is really, really crucial, I think, for the future of work. And with social skills, just to be clear on that, everything that surrounds human interaction, right? So this could be communication, collaboration, empathy. So there's a lot under the umbrella term of social skills. And I think having those social skills has become so important because, like I already pointed out, a lot of the problems that we work on have become very, very complex, but they have become not only complex so that you need your cognitive ability, but they've also become complex in the sense of there's a lot of people involved, a lot of companies involved. And I think social skills help you to deal with those problems. And I guess the pandemic has also shown this again, where interaction is really crucial. And I think the lack thereof throughout the pandemic has revealed big problems, actually. And I think it's a reason also for those massive attritions in companies is that there was too little human interaction. Like if that wasn't sort of focused on so much and people were working by themselves at home all the time, I think it really increased frustration. And I think it has really shown why we can work together quite effectively via Zoom and productively also. But the question is, how much interaction do we need? And I think we do need quite a lot of interaction to stay innovative, to stay creative. And those skills are just very important. And they sort of complement any kind of technology advances in a very positive way. Because also, if you think about being able to explain complex phenomena really is helpful for an employee nowadays, which maybe it wasn't so much previously because you could just do your thing, I guess.
Right.
Just to point out a couple of other, I guess, social skills that will become more relevant. Also, I mean, negotiation, like coaching, I think is something that has become really important. And this is something that is really relevant also to sort of overcome any kind of barriers for women, for example, because that is really just something like that is really important to be able to foster women and people who fit the norm less well in the labor market. But then, yeah, I think there's just a lot of very subtle things that have also become important that speak to those social skills, like embracing conflict. And this is not conflict among employees for personal reasons, but for like really on the conflict on the task itself. Embracing criticism, embracing challenge, embracing complexity and uncertainty. I think those are all things that are becoming really, really important in the wide field of sort of social skills, and haven't been in the focus for so much in the past, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say they've almost been actively discouraged in many cases. So if I think about challenge as a useful function where we can, for all the biases that we know and love, we can find ourselves in a position where we just keep doing the same thing repeatedly. And there may be a time where that's not appropriate. It may never have been the winning formula, may no longer be the winning formula. And so we need people to call this out and to try and jolt us out of it. And so that human function of being able to see things the individual can't and help them through that. And that applies both in the coaching sense, but also in the kind of challenge within meetings. I think it has in many respects not been gathered. You know, we structure meetings around consensus and agreement. So we have to reach an agreement at the end that everybody has to be happy with. So that sort of theoretically feels nice, but in practical terms, it leads to people not necessarily wanting to challenge if everybody else is moving in a particular direction. And so we've designed these structures, and I mean structures both in the sense of the way we do things, but also if I think about the way, what does going to the office achieve? What are we there to do? And I think as we look at it now, you know, there's no point in going to an office to do video calls that you could do from home. And yet that's still what a lot of people have found themselves doing. So we need to rethink, I think, the physical architecture of what workplaces are and where they are. And we also need to think about some of the structures that we've got in terms of, as I say, how meetings are run, the language we use to talk to each other, all of those sorts of things to foster these sorts of dynamics that you're talking about, because I think they become more and more important as we look at technology, for example, allowing us, you know, we can make much bigger mistakes much quicker now because of technology.
Yeah.
So it can also do successful things very quickly, but we can roll out stupid ideas at a much higher rate than we could before. And so the skills of challenge, sort of, I need calibration here, natural human pieces that we all recognize from our personal lives, I think become more and more important. But that requires a fundamental set of changes to allow that to happen.
I agree. And like the way we've structured the work, like a lot of it is still very hierarchical and those kind of things. I think a lot of those legacy ways of doing things really need to be questioned. And I think it's difficult, particularly for like junior employees. It's very difficult to be like, oh, something is going wrong in this meeting. I want to call this out. I think it really is hard unless someone in the meeting says in the beginning, well, we embrace any kind of criticism and conflict. So please do feel free to speak up at any point in time. And then creating those sort of environments where everyone is confident in participating and confident in also criticizing, I think is really crucial. But it's something that hasn't been done so much previously. And I think I guess even previously it would have been important, right? It's not just the fact that our world is changing that has made this relevant. It probably has always been relevant, but I guess now even more so. Because like you said, the risks have just increased. Like you can much easier like trap into big mistakes that maybe previously weren't so important or weren't so big. So now it really is important also to mitigate specific risks, I think.
And I think that's a really good point, right? That it's always, this challenge has always been there. But it's interesting is that we've often talked about the need for these things. So we do have processes that purport to provide those sorts of dynamics. There are sort of challenges and processes that we go through to make sure that happens. But I think they've either not been very successful in the past. We've perpetuated sort of very inefficient versions of them, sometimes because it's in people's interests. You know, I want to look like I'm being challenged, but actually I'm not really interested in that. So we, chief execs that hold meetings to say, ask any questions you want, but there's a clear sense in the room that if anybody asks a question that's genuinely challenging or seen as inappropriate, there will be consequences for that, and people will be ostracized. And if you ask too many unpleasant questions, you'll be thrown out. So we've always recognized the value of it, as you say, but I think lots of processes in many respects have been designed to look like on the surface that they're encouraging that, but actually underneath it all, the realities is they've driven alternative behaviors. And so it's something that we've always known needed to be there, because that's why we pay lip service to having these processes. But actually, in many cases, they weren't operating the way we want. And that's no longer sustainable, I guess, now with transparency. And so all of the dynamics you've pointed towards, I think are gonna force change, even if people don't want that change.
Yeah, and I think it's normal that people don't want that change, because it is hard to be criticized, and it is difficult to be challenged all the time, and there's a lot of responsibility also if you have to make decisions, and if you have to make decisions but have to stay agile and have to stay adaptable. It's just there's a lot of extra sort of burden on people now that is really hard. So that's why I think that those trainings and those things are just really important to be able to sort of cope with this, and to be able to embrace it also and see it as something that's positive, at least in the long run, even if it's hard work in the beginning. Because I really think that changing a lot of the structures that we have in place is difficult, and it requires like effort, and people might be reluctant to change things also. I think change is something that people generally don't necessarily like as much. Or it's difficult within an organization to foster change. And I think that really is a challenge that we have to sort of tackle.
That's a very positive note on which to end. Before I let you go, tell us a little bit about, you've talked about where your research has taken you so far. Is there anything else that you're sort of itching to look at, or what's next in the pipeline?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm developing this index, and I'm hoping I will soon have results. So I'm developing an index that captures what makes an individual inclusive, because I really think, and this speaks to a lot of what we talked about today, I really think that there is something about individuals that can be measured that captures all those things that we talked about, like the willingness to embrace risk or willingness to embrace challenge, those kind of things. And rolling this out, I'm hoping to be able to implement this index also as part of within companies, and to see whether it actually has a positive effect on team dynamics, or whether it captures something about a company or about an individual that measures what we've just talked about and helps us understand inclusion much better. And still looking a lot into the future of work also. So maybe the whole COVID thing, I think I will also be researching a lot more about, and seeing what comes out of this and how we can make sense of it, I think will be really interesting going forward.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you so much for what you're doing, because I think it's really, really interesting, and I think these are important subjects that we need to explore and understand if we want to move forward as a species and get the best out of everyone and solve the problems that we're facing. But thank you also for coming on the podcast and being an incredibly stimulating guest and giving me lots of things to think about, and I'm sure my listeners as well. I'll put links to the Inclusion Initiative and anything else, Cecily, that you let me know that you want to share with the listeners. But thank you so much for appearing on the show.
Thank you so much, Christian. It was really fun talking to you. Very inspiring. Thank you.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Cecily for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Cecily, the skills of the future and her work at the Inclusion Initiative, and to hear those episodes featuring the director of the Inclusion Initiative, Dr. Grace Lordan, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. To find out more about human risk and human reward and the work that I do with my clients, visit human-risk.com. I'll be back very soon with another episode of this show, again exploring some of the Inclusion Initiative's work, so stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, stay safe and thanks for listening.